Hello guys, welcome back to another Division 2 video. In today's video, we're going to be breaking down a super powerful skill damage build that will make completing activities out in the open world a whole lot easier. This is a skill damage oxidizer build that is extremely effective and viable for almost any activity, including legendary missions. And although it's possible to solo legendary missions with this build, it will be crazy difficult and tedious to do, so I wouldn't recommend doing it. It would be a whole lot easier if you were in a group, but if skill builds is your playstyle, then it will be even more possible to solo. The only major downside to this build is the huge lack of survivability, so you must be in cover quite often to stay safe, but aside from that, it's actually a very powerful skill build and it's fun to use. So if you enjoy using skill builds, you just might find this build highly favorable, and if you're interested in using this build for the Dark Zone, it will work, but stick around till the end, and I'll show you a version that will work a lot better for PvP. But for PvP, I recommend only using this if you are in a group, because like I already mentioned, the survivability is bad. I'm just gonna keep it real with you guys. However, the damage is amazing, and as the old saying goes, a great offense makes a great defense. Now, without further ado, let's get started. Okay guys, I'm not really a skill build player, but I honestly had a lot of fun using this build in PvE. Just seeing how much damage this oxidizer can do when you have the right attributes and weapon specialization set up is truly impressive. It's so satisfying seeing the NPC's armor just melt away rapidly. I was even surprised to see how effective it was in this legendary mission run I did earlier. However, I did struggle a bit taking down the legendary Chunga heavy NPCs, but since I have the capacitor and the weapon damage is fairly decent, I had no problem taking them out. And this oxidizer build is so strong that it will still be effective at taking out the warhounds and mini tanks. You might have noticed that I'm running the Artificer Hive for my secondary skill, and that is because it will basically increase skill damage significantly. So the oxidizer will be hitting so much harder. I'm gonna go into the breakdown of the build in just a second so you can see where all this skill damage is coming from, because this build is a bit complex. For the primary weapon, I am using the Capacitor Exotic Assault Rifle. The Capacitor is an ideal weapon to use for any skill build, and that is because of the talent Capacitance. I'll touch more on this talent later, but for those who don't know, this weapon talent will basically be increasing both your skill damage and weapon damage. For the secondary weapon, I'm using the named Test Subject Assault Rifle for the talent Perfectly in Sync. This talent is also great for skill builds, and I'll also touch more on this talent later, but basically, the In Sync talent will also be increasing both your skill and weapon damage. For the mask, I'm wearing the Empress International brand set, and since I have 3 pieces equipped, I'm getting all 3 attribute bonuses, so 10% skill health, skill damage, and skill efficiency. And for the attributes, skill haste, skill damage, and a maxed skill haste mod. So you basically want to have either skill damage or skill haste rolled for your attributes. Status effect won't be necessary, because skill damage will increase the strength of your oxidizer, and skill haste will speed up the cooldown for each charge. Right, so now for the chest piece, another Empress International with skill haste and skill damage. Now I am using glass cannon for the talent, and I highly recommend you do as well to ensure you are doing as much damage as possible. But if you don't like using glass cannon for whatever reason, I get it. It's a risky talent, however, you do have another option, and that's the Kinetic Momentum talent. The Kinetic Momentum talent is a great alternative, and I actually swap out glass cannon for it from time to time. So for those who don't know, when you're in combat, each skill will generate a stack while it's active or not on cooldown. These stacks will increase your skill damage by 1%, capping at 15, so that's 15% added skill damage. And this talent works really well with the Waveform Exotic Holster, and the Waveform Holster works great with skill builds. The talent Alternating Current will generate a stack of 3% skill damage on one of your skills every second, capping at 10. Then after 10 seconds at the cap, the stacks will transfer to your other skill. So this Waveform Holster really helps with the skill damage a lot, and if you're firing your capacitor, you will build stacks to a cap of 40. Each stack will grant you 1.5% skill damage, however, after 5 seconds, stacks will decay. But that isn't too much of a bad thing, because you will mainly be using your oxidizer to deal damage. And these stacks can actually be monitored beside your weapon for those who may not know, so what you can do is build up your stacks, then after you get it maxed out, shoot your oxidizer, and it will deal deal out more damage. Now, the great thing about the capacitor is you will get 7.5% increased weapon damage for each skill tier you have, and since this build has 6 skill tiers, that's what? About 45% added weapon damage, so that's great. Also, if you don't have the capacitor, then just use either the named test subject assault rifle or the Harmony named rifle if you have. I don't have the Harmony named rifle, but it does come with the talent perfectly in sync. Worst case scenario, if you don't have any of those weapons that I mentioned, then just grab your favorite AR or SMG and roll the talent in sync on it. In sync will work fine as well. At least in the meantime, until you get perfectly in sync, there is only a 5% difference between the normal in sync and perfectly in sync. And by that I mean 5% in the skill damage and weapon damage increase. For the gloves, Empress International with skill haste and skill damage, and for the knee pads, I chose to go with a one-piece Bellstone Armory for the 1% armor regen bonus, which helps a bit with survivability, because you will be taking quite a bit of damage, especially if you decide to use glass cannon. While in cover, you can be slowly regenerating your armor even though it isn't much, but if you would rather not use Bellstone, then go with one-piece Hanayu for the extra skill haste, but I highly recommend using Bellstone for the armor regen. For the backpack, I'm using Wyvern Wear because one piece grants 10% skill damage, so it's super helpful. Rolled with skill damage and status effect, but ideally, you want skill damage and skill haste instead of status effect. And for the talent, tech support will further increase skill damage by 25% for a whopping 25 seconds. That's a crazy amount of time for that amount of increased skill damage in my opinion, so that's definitely a positive thing. But this buff does require you to get a skill kill, which you will be doing quite easily anyway with the oxidizer. So yeah. Okay guys, I'm gonna show you the PvP version of this build in a second, but for the weapon specialization, Technician is required for the Artificer Hive. Okay, and not only that, but Technician will give you an extra 10% skill damage, so it's another positive. And for those who are curious, for the stats on my capacitor, 20% critical hit chance and 75% critical hit damage. I know, not high enough to deal heavy weapon damage, but this is a skill build, so. Okay, so this version works really well for PvP, but I recommend only using this if you are in a group. That way you can provide good crowd control and support damage for your team. But just be aware that this build lacks survivability, so it will be hard staying alive if you are using this solo, okay? So I decided to use the Firestarter chem instead of the oxidizer because Firestarter works better in PvP in my opinion. Because not only can it deal damage quickly, but it sets players on fire while dealing burn damage over time, and the damage ticks can get pretty crazy, especially if you're wearing the exotic vial mask. I'm still wearing the waveform holster, but if you have the vial mask, you can use that instead since it will help with damage over time, and since I'm using the Firestarter chem, I now have status effect and skill damage rolled on my pieces. The initial damage, as well as the burn damage over time, is super strong and melts players. The oxidizer, on the other hand, can easily be evaded by players, and it doesn't apply a status effect. Okay, now, for the backpack, I'm using the Talent Creeping Death because it works a lot better in PvP as opposed to tech support. Creeping Death is great because if you apply a status effect damage to a player, it basically transfers to other players within 8 meters, and sometimes this can be more fatal than the initially hit player. This is why this talent is so great for crowd control. So 3 pieces of the Empress International brand set, 2 pieces of Wyvern Wear, and the Waveform holster. And I'm still using the Artificer Hive because it will still improve the efficiency of the Chem Firestarter, but you can also use the Burn Sticky Bomb, which is extremely overpowered, by the way. So yeah, this is Prajna. I hope you found this video helpful. Don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you're new to the channel. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. Keep it cool, keep it classy, and see you in the next video. Peace out.